Welcome to ICCE Intermediate Part 3 on culture, and this particular one is how cultures are formed. So then, what is culture? Where does it come from? What makes it? Well, it's the effect of family and pressures by four major sources. First of all, politics and religion. I put those two together because oftentimes politicians use religion as a moulder. Secondly, education, what we learn at school, but education is much bigger than school, of course. It's all the things that we learn. So all of those things are having an effect. Art and media. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, everything art-wise and media-wise, newspapers, posters, television, film, books, advertising, leaflets, anything that's to do with art and media is actually having an effect on the culture, and advertisers are always trying to mould the culture. Economics, the way we spend money, the fact of the matter is, if you haven't got a roof over your head, that economic effect on you and your culture will mould the way you think and the way you are. If you've got no money to buy food to eat, that is moulding your culture. So economics is a massive moulder on our culture.
Culture is not static. It's constantly changing, though sometimes we're not aware of the fact that it's changing. Usually we're not aware of it because it changes slowly. If you think about changes over a few hundred years, oftentimes those changes have been very, very gradual. Every so often, though, there will be a cataclysmic event that makes culture change very fast. So things like the Industrial Revolution, things like a war, things like the change in economics can very quickly affect a whole culture and the way people act and are. I think it's a slight problem, but almost culture is becoming generic, and we see the same things all around the world, and we live in what's called the global village. So some things are very samey wherever you are. We go to different airports around the world and you look around on the shelves in the duty free and you'll find that the things that you saw in Zurich you can see in Dubai and Kuwait and wherever you actually end up. So there is almost a moulding of a world culture. I've often said that if you go next door to your neighbours and they're very similar to you and they're the same, speak the same language, look the same colour, and actually are very much like you, nevertheless you have changed culture. As you know, that if you go to a relative's house, an aunt or an uncle's, there are things that they will do differently. Their cultural expression at home will be just slightly different to the ones that you have in your house. Now sometimes those things are so small that we hardly notice them, but they are there. You are actually crossing a culture.
The most powerful global influence on culture, what is that? Well, I would say it's probably film and movies. And as we know, they predominantly come from Hollywood in the West or Bollywood in the East, although we all end up in the end watching American movies, and whether we like it or not, or whether we believe it or not, we are all culturally affected by those movies. Let's try and look at some of the major current effects on culture, both historically and what we consider is really the current situation. I'm going to give you some of the major cultural changes that have happened in the West, and specifically in the UK. I say in the West because if you're in a different country, the list would look slightly different and some of your history will be different. So we really are looking at history and the things that have caused the change in culture. So if you're in a different country from the UK, your list, maybe you should do one, will be slightly different to this one. I think our culture is under pressure. So we're going to look at a little bit as to why that might be, and I want to look at some historical perspectives. So first of all, what has happened? Well, historically we had the Industrial Revolution. One of the things that did, of course, was to pull people from the countryside into the towns. And the pace of urbanisation is continuing, and actually it's getting faster, and there are bigger and bigger cities all around the world. So that's just not a UK phenomena, that's a worldwide phenomena. But then for the UK and also many parts of the world, one of the great historical changes of our culture was the last World War. What are the things that really changed because of that war? Well, the biggest change I think you'll find was that of women's roles. Before the war, people used to go out to work before they got married, but women, as soon as they were married, would stay at home. If you go to the museum in Cadbury's, which was a really good company in those days, set up by Christians, and it was a company that did things that were very special. They built a factory in a garden because the company wanted its workers to live in a nice place. It had workers' representatives on the board. But the funny thing was that if you got married, you were presented by the director with a carnation. Don't ask me why it was a carnation, but I know that's what they gave you, and a Bible, and the director shook hands with you and said goodbye, because now you were married and you would leave work, and that was the norm. But of course after World War II, that did not happen. Women had gone out to work because all the men were away fighting, and somebody had to do the jobs, make the ammunition. And when the men came home from the war, the ones that survived, they discovered that the women didn't want to go back home and be in the home, but they wanted, many of them, to stay at work. They liked the freedom, they liked the new friends, they liked having their own money. So that changed the culture in the UK in a huge way. Then, where we are today, there is huge, fast rate of change. Change is happening all the time, and it's happening very quickly. Of course, change has always gone on, but it's never been as fast as it is now. And that changes the culture. So culture is always changing, but it's changing faster today than it's ever changed. Then, I think that because the culture has changed in these ways, things have actually got lost. One of the things I think we've lost is the loss of absolutes. There are no absolutes in our culture. The absolutes change all the time. I would argue that there is a loss of a moral base. And without a moral base, going back to judges in the Old Testament, everybody does what is right in their own eyes, and sometimes you can have total chaos from that. There's a loss of spirituality, not entirely, and I'll talk about that a bit further on. There's a loss of faith in science. Now people say to me, when I've been talking about this subject in colleges and universities, oh no, people still trust science. We really believe in science, do we? You can think of some things, I'm sure, as to why people might not trust science. One of the big things, of course, in our day has been the BSE crisis, or as it's commonly called, mad cow disease. And currently, while I'm doing these lectures, is the whole situation of genetically modified food. We don't trust it. We don't trust what the scientists are telling us. There's also been a loss of traditions. Now, some traditions I think need to be lost, but many traditions are very good, and when we lose them, we lose our sense of direction and we lose stability. And that's really the last thing I wanted to say, is a loss of stability. And when we lose stability, and change happens so quickly, we're not sure what on earth is going on. Where am I? What's happening? What am I doing? What is the reality of my life?
Change. Well, change is here to stay, they say, and of course change is what goes on in culture. But in the United Kingdom, institutional change has been huge. Now, there were situations or institutions like some of the banks that had been in place for hundreds of years, and yet in the last decade we've seen them close down for all sorts of reasons. Technological advance has been incredibly rapid. Things that are absolutely brand new are now standard and ordinary. Today, talking to you on this slide is the day 80 years ago today, the 2nd of November 2016. 80 years ago was the first day that television started broadcasting from Alexandra Palace in London. They reckon that only about 400 people had an instrument, a television in other words, able to watch those programs. And television, one channel, only happened for 2 hours a day, between 3 and 4 and between 9 and 10 at night. Amazing, isn't it? Now we just take it as normal. And now, of course, we can watch hundreds of channels, and we can watch all of those things on the phone in our hand or our iPad, whatever. Now, some of those changes have been good for us in a way. The material advantage to those changes and the way that they have affected the culture have been massive. I'm old enough to remember that my grandmother used to do the washing at home, and it took her, on average, 3 days to do the washing. Day one, she would put all the clothes, bit by bit, the right colours, into a thing which was called a boiler. It certainly wasn't a washing machine, and it boiled away, and she would prod it with a stick. The next day, she would spend putting all the clothes out. Hopefully it was not raining, but she would dry them, hanging them on the line in the courtyard, and it would be waiting for it all to dry. And day number 3, she would iron it. Or the following week, the same process would all take place. Now, we shove it in a machine, press a button, or a dryer, press a button, and there we go. And it's actually freed up huge amounts of time. So the material advantages that we experience, even though we think maybe we haven't got much, but in reality, compared with 100 years ago, our material advantage today is huge. That's the way that's affected culturally the way we spend time, things that we do and how we do them. I wonder what things you have noticed in terms of change in your life. Maybe you should think about it. Maybe you should ask a question about women's roles. Is that still changing? Has it changed? What has changed? Technology. Of course, every year it seems to me that the computer people, the telephone people, all bring out new things that weren't on your phone last year. It's totally amazing. I bought my wife for Christmas an old telephone. Yes, it was an old one of those old black things that stood in the corner and was fixed line. And a young lady that's living with us at the time said to me, "What is it?" I said, "It's a telephone." She said, "No, that's not possible." I asked, well, why isn't it possible? She said, well, because it hasn't got any buttons on it. I showed her how to work an old-fashioned telephone. It actually had new technology inside it, but they've made the old-fashioned telephone work with the old dial that you moved your finger around on it. I have to say that the young 14-year-old looked at it and said, that's very interesting, but I couldn't use it. I said, why couldn't you use a telephone like that? She said, because it would break my nails. Then urbanisation, as I've already said, many people are moving into cities, and cities are growing at a huge rate. And if you think about the size, just have a look at some of the sizes of a city like New Mexico or Brasilia or Lagos or some of the Indian cities or the Chinese cities, and see the huge populations that live there now. And still people are moving from the countryside into the city. And then, as we've already talked about, the fast movement of change in our world in which we live, mostly brought on by technology, but other things are occurring as well. But technology is probably the greatest and fastest mover of cultural change. I'm going to give you a shorthand list. It's like a quick analysis of what happened in the UK during the last decades. I've already said, if you're in another country from the UK, your list should look slightly different to this one. But this is a UK list. Maybe you'd like to make your own, or maybe you'd like to disagree with my list. Anyway, let's see. Here's my shorthand look at the last decades. So, the 1940s, well, there was a war going on. So, my shorthand is war. In the 1950s, the war was over. It was a time of expectation. It's all going to get better now that the war has finished. New housing, new health services, new opportunities, new jobs, new prosperity, and so on. In the 60s, it was a time of revolution, so my word there is revolution. What was happening in the 60s? Well, if you remember, it was that time when people were saying peace and love, free sex, let's all just do exactly as we like. Let's throw all the rules overboard. Let's have a revolution. So my word for the 60s is revolution. 70s, well, my word for the 70s is disillusionment. Why was it such a disillusioning decade? Well, it was a decade of disillusionment because all of the things that the revolution had promised in the 60s didn't happen, and it brought us tremendous problems. The 80s in the United Kingdom I've listed as a time of selfishness. The government at the time was saying that there's no such thing as society, there's no, we're all individuals, look after number one, prosper, do well, and blow everybody else. And it created time, I think, and that was coming from the politicians. That's how politics affect a culture. And it brought about a huge selfish generation, I would say, in the 80s. And so that's my word for that decade. The 90s was a decade of despair. The New Musical Express, which was a young people's magazine, very popular in the 90s, I think it's still around, but it was very, very popular in the 90s, they did a big survey and noted that suicide actually increased in that particular decade. It was a time of despair. The 80s selfishness, I think, bred within the culture that time of despair. So now, at the moment, we're in the noughties. So what do we do about the noughties? What was it about? Was it about recession? Was it about new kind of politics? What is it that is moulding the culture in 2016? So, in conclusion of section 3, why am I talking about all these things? Why is knowing about culture important? What is the purpose of it all? Well, because if you're to be effective as a human being, you need to know about culture. you to be effective as a human being, you need to understand culture, not just yours, but you do need to understand your own, and you need to understand other people's. I think we also need to understand where it is we can get wisdom from. So wisdom tells us how to use a culture, or tells us how to use everything else. Knowledge is one thing, wisdom is something totally different. I think we need to understand why we think as we think. Very often we act and react and do things. Eventually we might say, well, that's because it's my culture, but actually we need to say, why do I think like this? We also need to understand why others think as they do. What is their culture? What is their upbringing? What is it that has moulded them and made them to act and think and work things out like that? If we understand culture well, we will then better understand the nature of conflict. Actually, conflict is caused when cultures clash. So one culture thinks this is right, another thinks that is right. That creates conflict, and conflict creates clashes. Sometimes I think we need to understand culture so that where necessary, we can correct our thinking. So we need to say, my culture has moulded me and made me to think like this, but is my culture correct? Is this action of culture the right way to be? Is there another area where I need to get my values and my actions from that is different to what has been produced by my education, my upbringing, my relationship to my family, the country that I was born in? Is it all correct? Some of it may be. Some of it may be what I call amoral. It's neither good nor bad, it's just as it is. Some things in our cultures are obviously not good at all and need to be changed. We need to understand those things. For our test for this section of the course, the test this time is to watch the film called Goodbye Lenin. This is a film that's, I'm afraid, only in German with subtitles, so enjoy. It's actually quite funny. I'd like you to indicate in your essay some of the differences that you see between the two cultures that I've talked about. This film obviously talks about two very distinct cultures, and tell us what you think is going on and what you think has caused the differences in the two cultures. So 500 words, essay, what's caused the differences in the two cultures and what are the major differences that you perceive in this particular film. Enjoy.